Listen to the sound a museum never records. The tiny rasp of a pencil in a pocket. The click of a bicycle freewheel on a night road. The paper hush of a passport page turning in a hot consulate. The damp, steady breath of a man under a pier as he counts the seconds before he moves again. Wars are remembered in trumpet notes and headlines. But the hinge moments, when futures tilt, are often carried by hands that never made the front page. Tonight, we follow some of those hands, and we begin with a man who broke into hell to write it down. And Witold Pilecki did not look like a myth. He looked like a Polish cavalry officer with an orderly's neatness and a face that held worry like other men hold a watch. In 1940, when rumors about a new German camp near Oswiecim sounded too terrible to be true, he volunteered for a mission that should not have had a volunteer. Get arrested in a street roundup, get sent to the camp, organize resistance inside, and smuggle the truth out. NHE let himself be swept into a truck. He learned the number the camp gave him, 4,859, faster than his own name. He learned the rhythm of terror, the roll calls that lasted until the cold forgot your bones, the soup that tasted like a lie, the way a guard's boot scraped the gravel when boredom turned to cruelty. People whispered Auschwitz like it might hear them, and Pilecki built a network where a network should be impossible. A potato peel became a message. A cough at the right time turned a work detail into an intelligence exchange. He memorized dates, names, counts, how many arrived, how many left as smoke. At night, he wrote in his head and prayed his memory would not betray him. A smuggled radio, hacked together from parts no one should have found, breathed first reports to the outside. Couriers carried scraps of paper in false souls. Information crossed rivers and borders by the slowest, bravest method known: people. Pilecki's reports reached London in 1941 and 1942, describing gas, crematoria, industrialized murder. Facts that sounded like fiction, and for that reason were sometimes filed under check again. Still, the record existed. The camp could not be shrugged off as rumor. He did that, one man with frostbitten hands and a borrowed pencil. And after nearly 3 years inside, Pilecki did the second impossible thing. He escaped. He slipped through the camp's ribs on a work detail, ran through a night loud with dogs, hid in a barn that smelled like warm hay and fear, and then walked home across a country where the earth itself seemed to have ears. He wrote a full report. He argued for an attack on the camp, anything to interrupt the machine. The war, with its own arithmetic, said no. But the testimony went to archives and cabinets and, eventually, trials. One person's choice changed how the world would be forced to look at itself. Forgotten heroes aren't always men with rifles. Sometimes they are men with stamps. Kaunas, Lithuania, summer of 1940. Heat makes the ink sticky. A line of desperate families wraps along the wall of the Japanese consulate. Their eyes ask the same question in a dozen languages. Is there a way out? Chiune Sugihara stands at his desk, coat off, tie loosened, face set in a calm that keeps falling apart and being repaired. Tokyo has told him no. Do not issue transit visas without the proper papers. The proper papers would take weeks. The line will not survive weeks. He looks at his wife. She looks back with the courage of someone who knows the answer and is waiting to hear it said out loud. He dips his pen and begins to write. He writes for hours, then sleeps for minutes, then writes again. His cramped right hand balloons to twice its size. He shakes it out, flexes the fingers, and keeps going. He writes visas to Japan for people he has never met, visas that will let them cross the Soviet Union by rail if they can pay for a ticket and endure the ride. He stamps and signs even when the official seal begins to heat under his palm. Outside, the line stirs forward an inch at a time, hope adjusting itself like a shoulder under a load. When Tokyo telegraphs again, stop, he does not stop. He moves his desk to the hotel after the consulate closes and keeps writing. On the last day, as the train pulls out, he leans through a window and throws stamped visas to hands that reach like plants toward light. He tells the crowd, "Please forgive me." I cannot write anymore. I wish you the best. Train wheels eat the track. The ink on the last visas isn't even dry. And thousands survive because of those pages. The math is unglamorous. A clerk violates orders. Families find a path across a continent. Years later, grandchildren laugh in kitchens in cities their grandparents could not pronounce. You can draw a line from a pen in Lithuania to a child's backpack in New York or Melbourne and say, this exists because one man chose to be useful instead of safe. Now take us north and put us under a mountain of steel. It is September 1943. A fjord in northern Norway holds a battleship like a secret. The Tirpitz, sister to Bismarck, vast and heavily guarded. A knife aimed at Arctic convoys and Allied plans. Air raids have hurt her but not killed her. The Royal Navy decides to try something smaller and stranger. Attack with midget submarines. X-Craft, tugged most of the way by full-size subs, then released to creep under nets and drop explosive charges beneath the hull. Imagine the air in an X-Craft. Diesel and sweat and the damp of your own breath hitting cold steel and dripping back on your neck. 4 men in a tube the size of a delivery truck, hands on levers and dials, eyes on watches, nerves on wire. They memorize every sound the sea makes, the slow chuff of an enemy generator, the whine of a patrol boat prop, the gaunt knocking sound when a hull flexes. NX-6 and X-7 slip and bump through layers of defense. Booms, nets, listening posts, and by miracle and stubbornness reach the target. Lieutenant Cameron in X-6 watches the outline of the Tirpitz pass overhead like a black continent. The crew release their side charges, ton upon ton of explosive with clockwork hearts, and then fight to get out alive. They do not. Captured, soaked, and probably assuming they will be shot, they are hauled aboard and questioned. Minutes pass like hours. Then the seabed jumps, and NTHE charges go off. The battleship lifts, slams back, and screams through metal. Machinery rips free. Bulkheads crumple. The Tirpitz does not sink that day, but she dies that day. Her threat amputated. Months of repairs, and then more attacks, finish the story. The convoys breathe. Russia gets cargo it needed yesterday. A front that could have been starved keeps eating. You do not need 1,000 men to move a mountain. You need a few who will crawl under it and pin a fuse to its ribs. Shift to dark fields under low clouds. The sound of linen wings over hedgerows. NTO. The Germans. They were Nachthexen, night witches. To each other they were pilots, with faces chapped by wind and eyes that learned to see in the dark. The Soviet 588th Night Bomber Regiment flew wood and fabric biplanes built for training, not combat. Slow, open cockpit, no radio, no armor, a handful of bombs slung under the wings. Their advantage wasn't speed, it was audacity and a tactic so simple it feels like a magic trick. Cut the engine near the target, glide in silent like a falling leaf, release bombs by feel and moonlight, restart and climb before the searchlights agree on where to look. They flew low. They flew many sorties per night, up to a dozen, trading comfort for pressure on the enemy's nerves. German soldiers wrote home about the sound that woke them, air tearing lightly around struts, and the way sleep began to feel like an argument you couldn't win. Anti-aircraft crews learned to point at whispers. The women in the cockpits learned to read shadows and wind, to trust each other at altitudes where a mistake is not a lesson but an ending. They wore whatever uniforms could be spared, sometimes men's boots stuffed with rags, sometimes coats cut down awkwardly. They wrote notes on their palms with grease pencils. They saved their last, best jokes for when engines finally cut on the return leg and the cold made teeth rattle like spill beads in a can. The 588th's pilots racked up thousands of missions, earned honors, and buried friends with a tenderness that keeps not breaking long after the trumpets stop. In a war measured in tonnage and divisions, a unit measured in courage per kilogram, forced an enemy to move artillery and change habits. That is what strategy looks like when it wears a scarf. NNOT, all rescues are made with wings. Some are made with lies shaped to fit the target perfectly. Inside Britain, a web of agents, some real, some turned, some invented, fed Berlin's stories tailored to a listener's hopes. One of those voices belonged to a man who should have been ordinary, a clerk with a gift for languages, a patience for paperwork, and a flair for theater. He became an agent whose reports were so detailed and so unthreatening to pride that the enemy believed him even when he was wrong on purpose. He praised the competence of units he invented. He framed delays as regrettable but understandable. He apologized for small errors and guessed wrong in little ways to buy the right to be believed in big ones. NBUT, the voice without which that theater falters, belongs to three men in a cramped Polish office years earlier: Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rosicki, and Henryk Zygalski. In the 1930s, before the first shot, they used mathematics to take apart the German Enigma cipher's pretensions. They built devices, bomba kryptologiczna, that could chew through keyboard settings and spit out order where there should have been chaos. They taught Allied codebreakers how to think about a machine without magic in it. And when Poland fell, the work did not. The method crossed borders, packed in mines and suitcases. At Bletchley Park, a wider team scaled it into factories of thought, bombs clacking and clerks sorting and linguists squinting at phrases. But the first step came from a small city in a country the world thought would be erased. Forgotten here means taken for granted by people reading textbooks decades later. Every convoy saved by ultra-intelligence, every U-boat dodged because a signal lost its secrecy, owes a paragraph to three mathematicians who drew order from loops of wire. You can hear the same kind of mind at work in a French woman who moved through war as if it owed her a debt. Nancy Wake chose to be loud where quiet would have been safer. In Marseille, she funneled refugees to safety with a smile the enemy thought could not possibly be as useful as it looked. When the Gestapo learned her name, she vanished into a new one and came back through the night as an agent, parachuting into the Auvergne to help organize Maquis bands. She biked through 150 miles of police and patrols to replace a compromised radio code, legs turning like a metronome, teaching the landscape to count again. In a war that rewards men who speak in offices, she earned the right to speak in a field, face to face with men who had planned to ignore her. She did not ask permission to be decisive. Results are the best argument in any uniform. Take a breath. We've moved through continents in minutes. But the odd, stubborn thread running through each of these lives is this. The heroism is not loud in the moment. Pilecki's report reads like paperwork. Sugihara's visas are boring until you realize the pile of paper is exactly the shape of a human life saved. The X-Craft attack is a technical success report stitched with the names of men who didn't come back. The Night Witches, logs are just numbers and weather notes and coordinates. The mathematicians, notebooks are arcs and permutations. Nancy Wake's mission diary is a ledger of trains, meetings, passwords, and a bike ride. Let's add one more shadow to the edge of the frame before we pause. An American unit whose excellence had to argue past prejudice before it could argue with the enemy. NTHE 761st Tank Battalion, Black Panthers, trained hard, waited longer, and when finally loosed, drove into battle with a quiet fury that made every mile an affidavit. They broke through at Morville-le-Vicq, crossed rivers with noses in freezing water, fought in the Bulge when so much depended on so few, and kept moving where roads seemed to run out. Their motto, "Come out fighting," wasn't a boast. It was a promise kept under fire. For decades, their credit was folded into bigger paragraphs, their names into longer lists. History is finally practicing better manners. Notice what all of these people and units share. Not superpowers, not perfect plans. They share the ability to see a door where a wall claims to be, They share the refusal to let someone else's idea of proper process and a good idea. They share a talent for making their courage productive, turning bravery into outcomes rather than anecdotes. Here's how that feels, up close. And a courier on a city tram holds a newspaper folded to the crossword. The fill-in answers look like guesses. In the margins, written lightly, are numbers that mean arrival counts from a rail siding on the edge of a camp. He looks like a man who can't decide on a synonym for river. He gets off 2 stops early because he always gets off 2 stops early, and he walks with an unhurried gait that lies for him when truth would get him dragged into a van. The consular clerk wets a stamp with his breath because the ink pad is dry and the line is long and the heat makes temper short. He turns the page and turns a life. 2 desks over, someone coughs and it sounds like a gunshot, and then a baby hiccups and the room laughs, and a family takes that laugh with them through 1,000 kilometers of rail and a ferry and the scrape of a new language in their mouths. And under a mountain of steel, a man in an X-Craft watches the minute hand find a number that means he has to let go of the charge and trust the math he set this morning when his hands weren't shaking. He pats the casing like you would pat a dog, do your job. He knows the odds of getting out. He does not do odds tonight. He does levers and valves and the simple dignity of finishing what he began. In a biplane, a pilot spits grit out of her teeth and feels the air go from loud to whisper as she pulls the throttle back near the target. The ground climbs toward her like a friend with bad intentions. She counts, throws, feels the bump as the plane lifts a hair without the weight, and opens the throttle again. The engine coughs once, then catches. Behind her, a line of fire walks across an ammunition dump, and the night briefly looks like a day that changed its mind. And at a desk in a Polish office, 3 men stare at a pattern that refuses to settle. One of them scratches a chin with the end of a pencil, then starts writing fast, then slower, then smiles in the small way mathematicians do when a thing finally stops pretending and shows its shape. He goes home late, kisses his wife without explaining, and writes a note to himself. Try wiring like this tomorrow. And in a safe house, a woman empties her shoes of pebbles, rubs the arches of her feet, pours water on a rag, and cleans the chain grease off her calves so it won't mark the sheet. She eats soup so hot it makes her eyes sting and hears her handler say, "It's done," and lets herself believe it for 5 minutes before planning the next errand. These are the sounds. This is the way history actually moves, by people who decide not to let the story choose them. You can look for capes if you want. You'll miss the important things. We will stop here for a breath. In the next part, we will pick up more threads. A small group of Czech and Slovak agents who walked into Prague with a picture and a mission. A quiet American mathematician whose room of women pulled needles from haystacks so soldiers didn't die on beaches. Sailors in a destroyer that decided to be a wall. A team of librarians and curators who crossed a war to save a civilization's memory. And villagers in places maps barely admit who made a river too expensive for an army to cross. Different languages, different uniforms, the same sentence under all of them. Ordinary people deciding that ordinary was not an option today. Because the farther you get from the noise of drums, the more clearly you can hear the hinge creak. Listen, the hinge is moving again. Night in Prague, 1942. A tram rattles past a corner cafe with its blackout curtains knotted like clenched fists. A black Mercedes turns into a curve it takes every morning because a powerful man insists on routine. On a side street, 2 men in long coats breathe like runners waiting for the gun. They are not from here. They are the kind of patriots who had to leave home to serve it. Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubis have rehearsed this street in their heads until it feels like a room they built. They were dropped into darkness by a Halifax bomber months earlier, buried their parachutes like secrets, ate bread whose names they had to relearn, and lived among whispers. The German in the car is Reinhard Heydrich, the butcher, the architect, the cold hand. He has brought terror to a city and arrogance to this turn. NTHE plan is simple, because simple is all that survives first contact. Stop the car, fire the submachine gun, run like men who still have things to do. The gun jams. That is how most plans confess they were only guesses. Kubis, moving without asking permission from the part of the brain that wants to freeze, throws a modified grenade. It lands against the car and rips reality open. Glass and metal and certainty go in all directions. Heydrich staggers out, pistol in hand, hatred stitched into his face, then sinks. NTHE, two men don't get triumph. They get flight. They get cellars and drains and a church crypt where air tastes of candle soot and old stone. The search that follows chews the city. The cost is biblical, but the impossible just happened. Berlin bleeds. A regime that believed it owned cause and effect is reminded that a street can refuse to obey. Europe notices. Occupied people sit up straighter at kitchen tables. Morale is not a detail. Morale is fuel. NTHE crypt becomes legend. A priest brings water and absolution and a way to breathe. Grenades and bullets rake the nave. A fire hose floods a staircase. When the end arrives, it does not arrive as defeat. It arrives as a decision. We will not be dragged. Bodies are later pulled from water and laid out on the stone. For a long time after the shooting stops, shoes in Prague make a different sound on cobbles. Somewhere, a radio in London changes the tone in which it says the name Czechoslovakia. Two men opened a door and showed everyone there was still a hallway. Now, a different kind of room, a different kind of war. And across an ocean, in unglamorous buildings that smell like hot dust and pencils, a quiet American mathematician spreads a map on a table and pins strings to it until it looks like a harp designed by a spider. She is not alone. The room is full of women whose skill was misnamed clerical until the work started saving ships. They are code breakers, traffic analysts, statisticians, puzzle eaters with patience sharpened into a blade. They read not only what enemies say, but how often, and when, and from where, and to whom. They take a night's worth of meaningless clicks and make them into a convoy route. They learn the personality of a call sign. They find the flaw in a cipher's daily habit and pull until a seam opens. They do it without applause, without radios shouting their names, with the knowledge that a missed pattern becomes a hole in a ship. One of them, call her Eleanor, because there were many Eleanors, tracks U-boat pack movements as if they were wolves in snow, assembling each paw print from a different source, a weather report that didn't sound like one, a supply ship that needed too much fuel, a commander who always sent his daily summary 8 minutes later than everyone else. She overlays those threads with the sailing times of Allied convoys feeding Britain and staging for an invasion everyone is pretending not to schedule yet. She walks into a colonel's office with a chart that feels like fiction and says if you send the ships this way instead of that way for the next 10 days, half of them will arrive, which would otherwise not. He asks for proof. She points to patterns. He sighs the sigh people sigh before they change their minds. He changes it. The ships arrive. The soldiers step onto beaches months later, with bullets still in their weapons instead of water in their lungs, because a person whose name never reached a newspaper made the North Atlantic behave. D-Day would require weather, tide, courage, and a different kind of arithmetic. Losses you can accept versus losses you cannot. Rooms like these helped the balance tilt toward possible. And when the German Navy tried to guess the invasion's throat, it guessed wrong often enough to make right possible. Now, to a morning when a destroyer decided to be a wall, late Gulf, October 25, 1944. The sky over the Philippine Sea is the hard, clean blue that makes aircraft look like toys. On the water, small escort carriers, jeep carriers, and their little herd of destroyers and destroyer escorts are supposed to be safe. The big boys are elsewhere. Then the horizon grows teeth. The Japanese center force, battleships, cruisers, real killers, has slipped a net and found the thin place. What do you do when you are outgunned, out-armored, and about to be outlived? On the bridge of the destroyer Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans does the arithmetic and finds a fraction that equals charge. He orders flank speed, throws smoke, and turns toward the enemy alone. The rest of his little pack, seeing madness that looks like leadership, follows. The Johnston's 5-inch guns speak first. Torpedoes white-lace the water. The enemy hesitates. because even a giant knows to be afraid when a small thing doesn't flinch. And on the decks of those destroyers, sailors move in a ballet designed to fool steel into believing men can be as organized as machines. Shells up, shells in, powder in, breach closed, fire. A lookout calls splashes as if the sea were learning to type. A helmsman steadies a wheel, even as the boat beneath him seems to want to pivot the world. A radio man passes orders in a voice that refuses to raise itself. Haze wraps the scene like someone trying not to look too closely at courage. They take hits that should erase them and keep steering toward the place where a torpedo and a hull can have the loudest possible conversation. They do it again. The enemy commander, dazzled by grit and smoke and the lies small ships told with such conviction, turns away. Taffy 3. Those little carriers and their screen, live. Soldiers on the beach, live. History turns in a tight circle and falls back into the lane it needed. The Johnston will not come home. Evans will not either. A survivor will remember him saying he would take his men into harm's way, and they will remember he kept his promise to be first in and last out. Sometimes, a wall is a plank under your feet, a wheel under your hands, and a decision in your chest. While guns spoke, another kind of rescue moved through Europe with flashlights and clipboards. They were called the Monuments Men, though there were women among them, and the name makes it sound like they had time to admire frames. They did not. They were curators, artists, architects, archaeologists, librarians, people who knew how to hold a brush or a trowel and a map. They followed armies not to fight, but to ask a different question. After this town is liberated, what do we do to make sure its soul is not lost? In Italy, they stood in church aisles and begged commanders not to park tanks under frescoes because exhaust eats paint like acid. In France, they found sculpture in barns and crates under hay. In Germany and Austria, they followed a rumor to a salt mine and found halls of art stacked like treasure in a dragon story. Rembrandts, Vermeers, altarpieces, names written softly in labels because most labels were written by hands that fed the wood stove at night. They pried open tunnels and found a room of gold teeth and wedding rings and realized that art was only one kind of theft being returned to sunlight. They built lists. Lists look boring unless your grandmother's candlesticks are on one of them. They matched inventories to actual objects, and by doing so, matched memories to people. They made choices on roadsides about which truck to chase. They convinced angry men in uniforms that a canvas is not propaganda, it is somebody's chapter. They sent crates back across borders the war had pretended were permanent. In the process, they created a new idea that cultural heritage is not a spoil of war, but a patient that graveside medicine might revive. And then, beyond maps, in villages that don't get their names printed on posters, ordinary people made geography remember whose side it was on. Picture a river with a name you have to look up twice. A narrow bridge. A few dozen houses whose roofs had been mended the same way for 100 years. German trucks arrive first with orders to hold. A few locals disappear into sheds and come out with wrenches and a kind of patience that only people who work the same field every year can keep. They loosen bolts they know the army will not have time to check. They sprinkle sand on a ramp where traction will matter. They stack hay in an innocent place over a plank that hides a gap. They chalk a mark a driver will mistake for center. This is sabotage made from household knowledge. NTHAT, night. Under a moon that looks bored with war, a scouting party drifts a rope across the black water and ties it to a log where the current will push hard. They anchor the other end to a ring no one uses anymore. On the quay, when the first half-track tries to force speed in the morning, the log swings like a quiet knife. It doesn't flip the vehicle. It does something better. It makes the driver touch the brakes at the wrong second, and that small correction starts a dance that ends with metal sideways on a bridge too narrow for mistakes. Traffic jams behind. An officer shouts at physics. An artillery piece miles away misses an appointment. By the time someone cuts the rope and swears at a river, the day is different. People fighting wars make big plans. People living where wars pass learn how to move one bolt in a hinge so the door opens slowly. A partisan with a saw, a farmer with a tide table, a ferryman who lies about depth. This is strategy when strategy is stripped of epaulets. Now pull these threads tight. Nay, man inside the worst camp writes what he sees so the world will have to look. A diplomat writes visas until his hand hurts and he can't see his own signature anymore. Sailors drive a knife into the ribs of a battleship with the quiet courage of men who know they will probably not drink tea again. Pilots steer into blackness and drop bombs by feel to buy other women and men a little more sleep and a little less death. Mathematicians turn noise into maps. A spy makes truth wear a false mustache. A destroyer turns and shows teeth because somebody must. Curators find a painting in a salt mine and deliver it back to a wall where a child will stand 30 years later and feel something shift in their chest. Villagers make a river rude. What changed because of them? Convoys landed, lines held. Occupiers learned that terror could not chloroform a nation forever. A battleship stopped being a threat and started being a footnote. A code lost its swagger. A museum reopened. A child was born who would have been smoke. Notice the scale. None of this is mythic while it is happening. It is administrative courage, logistical bravery, stubborn decency. It is the courage to be boring until boring becomes the bravest thing available. NIFU are looking for the place where history turns. Don't stand by the general's tent. Stand where a woman in a wool coat is teaching another woman how to wire a detonator into a block of sugar, because that's what they could get. Stand where a man who has never learned to shoot straight learns to read train schedules like scripture. Stand where a sailor runs down a passageway that is breathing fire and still carries a shell because the next shot might be the one that matters. Stand where a clerk reaches for a stamp because a queue is waiting and a country is dying and the rulebook is wrong today. Remember this too. Many of these lives did not get their reward during their lifetime. Pilecki, after the war, faced a new tyranny and was executed by people who were afraid of what he represented. The quiet fact that one person can make truth heavier than lies. Sugihara sold light bulbs for years before a student found him and said thank you on behalf of a family that existed because his hand refused to rest. The women in those rooms went home without promotions and watched parades for men who never knew their names. Sailors were buried in coordinates. The monuments men went back to jobs where they hung paintings on nails and tried not to think of salt mines. And yet, the hinge creaked and the door opened, and the draft that moved through that opening was not a cold one. It was the breath of a world that had not yet given up on itself. NSO, here is the ending, which is not really an ending but an instruction. When you think of war, resist the urge to make it a panorama of arrows and dates. Remember the hand written in pencil that circled a number on a log. Remember the passport that smelled of glue. Remember the bicycle chain grease that blackened a woman's calf as she rode between radio sets. Remember the gaskets on a midget submarine, hand-cut by a mechanic who said little and never took long lunches. Remember a destroyer's wake hissing like a fuse in water. Remember a painting lifted from a crate and the dust that swirled and the silence that fell in that cave when someone whispered the artist's name like an apology. Remember a river that decided to be impolite. And remember this sentence that runs under all the noise. Ordinary people, when they choose to be responsible for more than themselves, can tilt a planet. That's not a slogan. It's an operating principle you can use outside of museums and beyond anniversaries. When a system tells you there is no room for you to matter, make room. When a rule is wrong in a way that hurts people, break it like a dam that should never have been built. When a job looks small, do it with an exactness that makes other people's bigger jobs possible. And when your name doesn't show up in the credits, take a walk under a sky that doesn't care and know that the hinge still creaked because you pushed bot N war's end. The habit of courage does not have to. It can move from basements to schoolrooms, from codebooks to keyboards, from rivers to rules. And once more, quietly, the hinge creaks. The door opens. On the other side, there is always someone ordinary, pen or wrench or wheel in hand, deciding the future is allowed to exist, And that is how forgotten heroes changed the course of the war and shocked the world, by refusing to wait for permission to be necessary, by doing the work no one else knew needed doing until it was done. And fate on a page turned, a stamp pressed, a switch thrown, a bridge unbolted, and a small human choice that ripples outward until shorelines change shape.